My name is Sarit Kahana. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white woman with long brown hair that's dyed green in the front. I'm wearing an orange sweater and I have a blurred background.
This is Steve Brown, he, him, and I'm a white male with falling brown hair, brown gray beard. I have a gray shirt and I'm sitting in my office, which has several pictures behind me.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve, so much for, lending your time today and talking with me. I really appreciate it.
I'm happy to. Thanks.
Yeah. So let's start. Let's go back to the beginning. And how did you meet Ed Roberts?
Well, I met him in early 19, and actually late 1990, but I knew about him for several years before that. I got involved in the disability rights movement in the early 1980s. And in 1982, I think, I was actually at a conference called Beyond Survival, which was in Denver, in the Denver area. And Ed was at that conference, so I didn't really meet him there, but I did see him and I knew about him. And then in the fall of 1990, I was hired to work at the World Institute on Disability. So I moved from Oklahoma to California and started working at WID, where Ed was one of the bosses. Ed and Judy Human and Joan Leon were the bosses. So I started working there, and that's when I met Ed.
Wow, that's really nice. It's kind of cool that you heard about him here and there, and then you got to work with him. So what role?
Read about him.
He's already building a legacy.
Yeah.
Before he came into your life.
Yeah.
What role did he eventually play in your life, and how did he influence the work that you ended up doing?
So when I moved to California and started working at WID, which at that time was in downtown Oakland, a lot of different things happened. So Judy Human was my boss. I was on a project called the Research and Training Center on Public Policy and Independent Living, and I was the training director. And at WID, I not only met Ed, but a lot of other people, including Lillian, who eventually became my wife. And so there were a lot of different things that were interplaying. But one of the things that was great about Ed was that he always wanted to talk to people. He always wanted to get to know you. And so I don't actually remember a lot of the things that we did that fall. One of the first memories I have of actually doing something with him was we both loved baseball. And so in the spring, when baseball started again, he invited me to go with him and his son, and I think a couple other people, certainly attendants, to see a game at the Coliseum in those days. And so we did that. And also, Ed and I both at that time, well, still had kids who were about the same age. So my daughter, who was back in Oklahoma, but who visited, I think she was about 13 then, something like that. And Ed's son, Lee, was also the same age. So we had that in common too. And of course, disability rights.
Right. That's really nice. It's really interesting to hear. I've heard here and there about how he was a real people person, real community focused. So that's really cool to hear. Even in his personal side, he was also kind of like that.
Yeah. In fact, by the time I met him, Ed was in his early 50s, I guess, when we met. And he was literally always late for meetings. And there were two reasons for that. One was he had to get up really early in order to go out because of all the things he had to do to get ready. Mm-hmm. But the other thing is, if he saw somebody with a visible disability on the street and he didn't know them, he'd stop and talk to them. And he felt like that was a really important part of his role. So, like I said, I knew him in his 50s. It might have been different in his 20s and 30s. I don't know. But by then he really had this reputation for always being late for meetings. And that was a big reason why. He was always interacting with people, talking with people.
Mm. Wow, that's really nice. I know that a lot of the time in the disability community, people are just so isolated and really in need of community. So
Yeah, exactly. Especially this is, early 80s and no social media. And,
Mhm. Right,
well, it
exactly.
was 90 by then, but still no social media.
Yeah, I feel like that's definitely helped a lot of people connect, which has been really cool to see.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so what wisdom did Ed pass down to you that you maybe still use today?
Um, well, I'm sure you know the story about he called himself an artichoke, right? You know that?
I do know it a little bit, yeah.
Yeah. So he described himself as I don't know, rough on the outside and lovable on the inside with heart, and he was full of heart, and at the same time, he was not um, a pushover. So if he needed to do things, he did them. To like one of my favorite stories, you might or whoever's doing the interview might hear this again with Lillian, but Ed was Ed was somewhere, I don't remember where, in Europe, and was in a um, airport. And for some reason that I don't remember, they were not getting the transportation he needed to get out of the airport to wherever he needed to go. And so Ed's response to that was eventually, after a lot of other things, was, well, okay, I'll just call the press and I'll have a press conference and tell them that the reason I'm not meeting with the prime minister or whoever it was some big shot, is because you can't get me transportation to get out of the airport and to get to this meeting. And they did. So, he was really smart about ways to use what he had to get what he needed.
Mm.
At the same time, he was a, what is the right word? He was a regular guy in the sense that, he would invite me and any other people over, but me, since we're talking about me, he'd invite me over and he'd be in his iron lung. And, I interviewed him a few times. So, and I interviewed him while he was in his iron lung, and maybe he was, getting some kind of physical therapy or eating or whatever. He was a real multitasker in that sense. And then kind of one other thing that I'm just thinking of when you're asking about that question is he and I had a common love. I was actually forgot about this until I was reading the questions and thinking about it. And the common love was potato chips. So, in those days, in 1990, early 1990s, WID sort of had this reputation within itself, if nowhere else, of being kind of focused on healthy foods. But whenever we'd have any kind of potlucks or anything, I'd bring potato chips, and I never took them home because they were always gone. So, I frequently was feeding Ed potato chips at those times. So, another kind of example of, getting what he needed. And I think that was a really big part of who he was, is that he was flexible and was focused on getting what he needed.
Yeah, that's really important. I think, as someone who's disabled myself, there's so many messages that we get that are to suppress what we need and not to, reinforce what we need, no matter what. Right? We're often told to, not to be pushing for what we need.
Right, exactly.
So that's really an important lesson to learn from him.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Ed is a regular guy, which is very true. And so I'm wondering more broadly, though, what his legacy, what do you see his legacy as, even as someone who is a regular guy?
Yeah, yeah. Well, he was a regular guy if you knew him, but if you didn't know him, like before I met him, for example, he was an icon,
Mm,
who's frequently described as the father, godfather. In those days when he was alive, he was described that way. It's the father, the godfather of the independent living movement. These days, seen as one of the pioneers of disability rights. And it's actually, I don't know if you know this, but I wrote a book about it.
I did know that.
So when you asked me that question, I haven't looked at this in a while, but when you asked me that question, I was thinking about the legacy part of things. And, a lot of, even shortly after he died, which was 95, going to independent living conference. Lillian and I used to do a lot of presentations. And so we were doing a presentation at an independent living conference. And even there, many people didn't know who he was. So one of the legacies is not only to remember what he did, but to remember who he was and to include him in our conversations about disability rights pioneers and advocates. And that kind of has two sides to it, I guess, in the way I'm describing it. One is he has this legacy, but it's a legacy that probably doesn't go far enough. So one of the things I always wanted to do, even when he was alive, was to get him into textbooks, get him into curriculum, something that you all have done a pretty good job of expanding it, at least far more than it was. But he has a lot of legacies. So he was the first person with his kind of disability who went to an American university and that had the impact of many other people following him, not only in Berkeley, but other places too. Mm. So he was one of the people who got funding to begin the first disability student services program. And of course, they're everywhere now, and not in the US, but all over the world. Mm-hmm. He was not the first, but he was probably the first prominent director of Center for Independent Living, which is not the first independent living center, as it's often described, but certainly one of them. Mm-hmm. And again, people came from all over the world to learn about independent living, and then Ed had a chance to go all over the world to talk about it. Mm. And there's a few other people who are around. One is another friend, a man named Adolf Rotzka in Sweden, who's in his 70s. So he was a contemporary of Ed, and he's often described by me, but by others too, as kind of the Ed Roberts of Europe. He got independent living going there. Mm. But he met it, and he facilitated it in a very different way. The Swedish independent living centers are cooperatives based on personal assistance, but a lot of it came from his interactions with Ed. Max Starkloff, who has passed away, but was the founder of Paraquat in St. Louis, another independent living center, got the idea of how to do that from meeting with Ed. Mm. And there were a lot of people who did that, Ed and other people, but Ed, because that's who most people were first meeting with in those days. Of course, he started, not by himself, but he started with, which is still around, the World Institute on Disability, and still impacting people. And he wasn't, maybe he was one of the first, if not the first, disabled people to get a MacArthur Genius Grant. So he had an impact in a wide range areas, not just in disability, but taking disability beyond disability rights and out into a broader audience.
Mm.
And of course, he did live to see and was involved in the passage of ADA.
Mm. Yeah, that's great. And I really didn't know about the kind of international aspect of this and the impact that he had in that way. And I think that that's, at the time, disability rights was so new that you really did have to collaborate with people who lived so far away to,
Yeah,
see how other people were doing things.
we, and I'm including myself now, because in the 80s, this is how we communicated. It was mostly, I mean, phone obviously was one way.
Mhm.
People who weren't so comfortable, like myself, on phone, we were writing.
Mm.
And a lot of the things that we were writing was going into newsletters or into magazines like the Disability Rag and Mainstream. And that's how we learned about each other.
Hmm.
And then conferences, of course, where we met each other.
Right. Wow. That's very cool to see. It's very interesting how communication has really changed over time in a big way.
A huge way, yes.
So before we talked a little bit about how Ed was a person,
Yes.
and I think that that is, an important aspect of him to remember as well. So do you have any kind of lighthearted, funny stories about him that you think about when you think of him?
Yeah. So this is not one I personally experienced. Maybe I'll think of one, but the one that came to mind is he was in Russia. This was actually after we had moved from California. So it must have been 94, 93, 94, 95, somewhere in there.
Mhm.
He was in Russia, and he was traveling with several other people, as he always did. And they were, I don't know if they were in Moscow, but they were in some city, and they were traveling. I mean, they were, sightseeing, I think. And a woman came up to him and asked if she could heal him.
Mm.
And his response to that actually was pretty interesting. He said, well, you can try, but don't make me walk or I'll lose my job. So then she leaned in to put her hands on him, which I don't think she had said she was going to do, but that's what she did, except his power was still on. So she leaned in and his wheelchair took off with her on it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so I don't know how far they went, but
Yeah, I bet she probably did not want to try to heal people after that.
yeah, well, I don't know if I'd go that far, but she might have stayed away from people in power wheelchair. And then actually, I don't know why that reminded me of this. I don't know if other people have said this, but he also learned karate.
Mm.
Is that something you're familiar with?
No, I didn't know that about
Yeah.
him.
So there was a guy, actually, I can't remember his name, when I was at WID, who would come in about once a week, I think, and he would teach Ed how to do karate with his chair. And that
Mm.
was because, of course, Ed felt vulnerable in a lot of different situations. So he wanted to learn self-defense.
Mm.
So he did.
Wow, that's very cool. I did not know that about him.
Yeah. I forgot about that. And I'm trying to think about other lighthearted things. Well, there's always the potato chips, of course. And baseball, baseball, actually, he was a big baseball fan. So, and I'm sure there are a lot of other travel stories, but, well, none come to mind, and no lighthearted ones come to mind. So,
That's
yeah.
okay.
So, but he was trying to think about that. He was fun to be around, but when I was around him, at least, he was pretty focused on, he was interested in what I was doing, in what I thought. And so he would ask about that.
Mm.
So we had some pretty interesting conversations, but they weren't necessarily jokes, lighthearted ones.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's very there's always something to do in disability activism.
Well, yeah, that, and I knew him for a short time, about 5 years.
Mhm.
So
Right. Yeah. So we talked a lot about how he was very much creating community everywhere that he went. So I don't know if you know this about him, but do you know how he found his support system within the disability community?
well, a lot of that had to do with Zona.
Mm.
So, because he lived with Zona much of his life. When I knew them, they had a house in Rockridge, if you know the Oakland area, but in Oakland.
Mhm.
And it had what kind of like what I'm in, except here it's called the casita, little house. There it was a grandmother's cottage, I think, or something like that,
Mhm.
where people could have their elderly parents or grandparents living with them. So he was in a separate building, but it was on the property that her house was on.
Mhm.
And Lillian, when she does her interview, can probably talk more about this, but she remembers when he was in a big house with Zona where his bedroom was the living room.
Mm.
And so a lot of activity revolved around that. But that's also true when he was a kid and after he had polio and came back.
Mm.
The house wasn't big enough for his iron lung and everything else he needed to go into one of the bedrooms. So it was in the living room. So there were always a lot of people around him. He had his dad, who died pretty young, but was alive at that point, and 3 brothers, I think, all younger. And so they were the first of his supports. And then I don't know how it originally started, but when they began first the disabled students program, which in those days was the physically disabled students program,
Mm.
and CIL, personal assistance was a huge part of what they did. So I don't know if this was as true with disabled students, but I think it was, where they had somebody who was focused on actually hiring attendants. And
Mm.
so, and actually that person at CIL and maybe at disabled students too was Zona for a long time. And
Mm.
so she knew what to look for in a personal assistance. And I think Ed, I'm sure he put in ads, and I'm sure he a lot of it was word of mouth,
Mm.
and some of it was just people he knew. Like I know that at least one of his assistants I can think of had a brain injury, but was mobile and not a brain injury where he wasn't functioning. He was functioning. So there was some, what do I want to say? There was some mutual supports in that kind of situation.
Mm.
But yeah, no, I don't think I know enough to actually say how it originally started.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
I had to think about that process.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I think having a support system in so many ways really influences the work that you do in the future. So that's
well, absolutely, and that's why I was introduced as support and personal assistance are not necessarily the same. I mean, it can be, you can have both. And some of your support network isn't necessarily your personal assistant if you have them, but it could be. And Ed, one of the things I think is that he was rarely alone. Oh, you may have seen this. There's a 60 Minutes interview with him.
Yeah,
So,
I have seen that.
yeah. So I was just thinking about lighthearted things, and I was gonna, if you hadn't seen it, I was gonna describe him getting his first motorized chair and going off into the sunset with a girl. but you know that.
Yeah, that is a good part of that for sure.
And actually, that interview was so good. I mean, I used it for years when I could find it to be able to share it, because in 15 minutes it captured Ed really well, but it also talked a lot about a lot of issues like transportation and other things.
Yeah, and I thought that um he really educated really clearly. You know, that a lot of the time interviewers are not completely up to speed on the disability community. So I thought he really um, laid it out for an audience who maybe is unfamiliar really well.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, what do you feel is important for the youth of today to know and to do to carry on his legacy?
Well, that interview reminded me of something that he said often, but it was in that interview, which is everyone, no exceptions, everyone has something to offer. So the key is facilitating that to happen. If it's somebody who, as he was, this is where the artichoke came from, is he was called a vegetable. So if somebody's labeled that, it's probably not true. I mean, there might be a few people around who really don't have any brain activity going on, but there's not many of those, and certainly not most of the people we call disabled. So I think from Ed, from my perspective, the most important thing is that everybody has something to offer and ought to be treated with dignity and respect.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important message for everyone to know about. And I think we're actually getting to the end of our questions, but what do you think Ed's dream for the disability community today would look like?
He was ahead of his time as a white person in working with other cultures and working with everybody, actually. He may not have done everything everybody wanted him to do in that context, but he was very aware of those kind of things. So I think in our multicultural 24/7 communication world, and our more awareness of diversity, that his dream would kind of be similar to Martin Luther King and Mike Auberger, who was a head of ADAPT for a while, and that is that everybody has a place.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, that's kind of a simplistic way of putting it, but
it's often a message that is overlooked.
Yeah,
when it comes down to it. Yeah.
And in order for that to happen, then that's where you have to go back to people need to be employed, people need to have access to transportation, to insurance, to housing, and all those other things that we as advocates have been talking about forever, it seems. But it's all leading to that. Oh, and the other thing is, I don't know if this is more me than Ed, but I'll say it anyway, which is that everybody should be accepted might be the right word, not tolerated, accepted for who they are. So that means, people who drool or people who speak slower or stutter or whatever it is. And Ed was really good as far as I saw with all kinds of people in all kinds of situations.
Yeah, definitely. I think sometimes when we are sometimes it's hard for people to put those beliefs into action. And so I think you're
Yeah.
right. It's absolutely really important to make sure that everyone is involved in this movement.
Yeah.
And it really does affect so many people. So it's really important that we're all involved as much as possible.
Yeah.